On today's episode, we're going to be talking about dopamine. We're going to discuss why it's important and how it pretty well lends itself to most aspects of your life. From then on, we're going to talk about something called the hero's journey and essentially how that stipulates an optimal way of living and, I guess in today's world, an alternate way of living.
I mean, I'll start with a question to you. Do you think there's an optimal set of behaviors that people should be engaging in?
I do. Yeah.
Or is it just random?
I mean, it's not just random. If it was random, are you asking in the sense, when you wake up in the day, can you engage in any behaviour? And is that not going to affect your dopamine? Or should you be careful what behaviours you engage in?
Well, I'm saying, is there some meaning to your behaviours? Is there some overall ending point, I suppose? Like, should you have direction, or is it more about, well, I have a whole set of things I could do today. Why don't I just do the highest rewarding activities?
Yeah.
That aren't necessarily beneficial for me in the long term.
I mean, well, your behaviours and your habits over time are going to sort of dictate where you go.
Yeah.
If you just wake up and do the highest rewarding behaviour every day, it's likely at some point further in your life you're going to pay the price for that.
Right.
So,
what leads you to that conclusion?
well, I mean, when you think of the highest rewarding behaviours, what sort of things come to mind? It's not sitting at home working or,
No.
reading a book.
No, it'd be
It tends to be destructive habits.
eating rewarding food or drinking alcohol or watching porn and stuff along
That's
those
right,
lines.
yeah. I mean, what is dopamine in itself? I guess, this chemical rush to the brain when you're doing something that brings pleasure, satisfaction or joy, right?
It's also the motivation one as well.
The motivation, correct, yeah.
Yeah.
But those sort of things tend to be, I guess, at the highest when you're engaging in behaviours that are enjoyable. And if you're doing that every day, how dangerous is that in the long run? Well, you can't just have a life of constant pleasure. So if we're going based on that notion, you probably should be careful about what you do every day.
Well, on the point of you can't just have constant pleasure, I don't think it's always black and white as to why. And I think
Yeah.
stipulating why is important. Like, there's the cliche of when you go out and drink, people say you're borrowing tomorrow's happiness in some extent. And because the reason they're saying that is because when you overload your dopamine system, you're going to have a withdrawal the next day. Your dopamine baseline is going to reduce below its normal levels. And because alcohol is a substance that releases high reward, well, tomorrow you're going to be, I suppose, balancing out what you did the night before to some extent. And I suppose that's an example to illustrate that you can do that cumulatively. Like if for 5 years straight, you're living really, I suppose, fast, if you want to put it that way. If you're engaging in very high releasing behavior for a long extended period of time, once you stop, you're going to have a period of depression or decompression where essentially your, I think, physical life as well as your chemical biology is going to have to, I suppose, catch up in some extent. And that usually looks like withdrawal.
Yeah, 100%. You can pay the price today or have fun tomorrow, or have fun today and pay the price tomorrow, right? You are a biological being and you can't just live a fast life forever, as you said. You will suffer at some point. Now, that may not be a problem for you. You may just want to enjoy and have fun, and that's fine, but understand it's not without consequence. You can't just have fun every day.
Yeah.
And if you are having this, I guess, so-called today's version of fun every day, is that even really enjoyable in the long run? If you don't know anything different but just waking up, whether it's getting plastered or whatever it is you like doing, how enjoyable is that going to be over the long run?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because when you talk about dopamine, novel behavior releases the most amount of dopamine. And novel behavior is behavior that's unique. It's something that you haven't done before. So essentially the first time you go out and you binge drink and you have a good time with mates, you're going to get this huge release But what happens over time is that the dopamine system gets accustomed to that. And over time, you actually release less and less dopamine from the same experience. That's why drug addicts that start off with a small dose, say, have to do larger and larger doses. And that's why people die from overdose and stuff like that, because their tolerance has gotten so high that they have to take way more of the drug to get the same amount of pleasure in some sense. So even there, we're already stipulating that you can't sustainably live a life of high dopamine release. Eventually, you'll reach a limit where your body gives out, essentially.
You're essentially just chasing a more and more exhilarating return
100%.
always to life.
Yeah.
You know, the first time you drink, it was awesome, but the 50th time, it's, I've done this 50 times, so maybe you try something else.
Yeah.
And you're pushing that limit more and more.
100%.
And I think that's the answer to the question you asked me at the start of the episode.
Yeah.
If you are just engaging in these habits, I said over the long term it's destructive. It's destructive because it's a threshold you keep pushing. And at some point, you know, how far can you go?
I agree.
Now, you know, people can do as they please, but I think it's naive to think that the things you do every day are not going to have some sort of effect on you long term. And I think dopamine has a big part to play in that.
100%. And I think we're at the point, I think, now where we're talking about, well, what's the alternative? Yeah. And I mean, this is sort of where you get philosophical because the world is so vast and there isn't one set of behaviors that strike people as, yeah, this is what I should be doing. You sort of do have to think about it a little bit. And I think we won't dig too deep into the philosophical side, but we will, I think, stipulate that it makes sense that you should be living in a way that's most beneficial for yourself and everyone else around you. That stands out as the most meaningful way to essentially exist. You're trying to bring the best good out of every situation in some sense, whether that be through your family, your community, your job, or whatever. It's no one set of behaviors or actions. It's that in any situation you're in, you should be striving to bring the best out of that situation in some extent.
What does that look like, though? What does living a life that is bring the best out of everyone look like?
Well,
I guess in my mind, it's probably not a life that is chasing these sort of, so to speak, cheap dopamines.
Well, cheap dopamines are, by very definition, self-motivated. And when you're completely self-motivated, you're excluding everything else. And by doing that, you are selfish. And the problem with that sort of behavior is you can't operate a community or a family or a business on those principles. Like, it can't be about what's my next gratification, exclusive to everyone else. If you look at how you define a psychopath, that's how they live their life.
Right.
It's all about me and my next exploit in some sense. And psychopaths are completely dysfunctional individuals. Like, it's not the optimal way to live at all.
I think the problem with this sort of cheap dopamine, and you said that self-motivating aspect, is like if you have some sort of goal, you want to operate a business, you want to get to this point in 10 years, if you're constantly thinking about that and thinking about that end result, that's going to fill you with dopamine. But that's actually decreasing your motivation to work towards that in the long run, right? Because you're almost giving yourself some of this reward, even though you've probably done nothing to work towards that. So you're actually demotivating yourself over the long run if you're doing that.
So you're talking about if...
That's a cheap dopamine.
Well, if you're thinking about the reward but not necessarily putting in the actions to achieve the reward, 100%. It's along the same novelty lines as well. Right. And over time, you'll get less and less dopamine from the thoughts and you'll be less and less motivated.
Well, don't you think that's why people tend to chop and change? Like, how many people do we meet that, you know, I've got this idea, then it's the next idea, then 2 months later it's something else? It's because they've almost exhausted their dopamine in that idea, so I'm on to the next.
It's an interesting point, and I've listened to a few successful people talk, and they say that most people have the $1 million idea, but the difference between someone that actually brings that to reality is the operation piece. Right. I think a lot of life and a lot of the struggles that people have are they don't know how to put the operations into practice. People are fantastic about the ideas part of thing because it is so naturally rewarding to think about the grand vision and the overall achievement at the end of the piece. But the reality is the steps to get there are actually the difficult part. And that's where the journey is essentially. And that's sort of where I want to go with this conversation a little bit. What's the actual journey to get to that overall final destination in some aspect?
So what you're saying is people essentially romanticize the end goal, but not the process to actually get there.
100%.
Yeah, which is, I mean, quite apparent in everyday life, I would say. And I guess dopamine, the reason it's so important and we talk about it is because it's very influential for goal setting and habits. And I guess where you're going to be in 10 years is going to be largely responsible to how you conduct your dopamine. And if you are chasing cheap dopamines, how hard's it going to be to work towards anything? That doesn't have to be, you know, building a business or, you know, being a bodybuilder, but I mean, there is merit into being physically and mentally adept.
Well, you said a very interesting point there. Where you end up in 10 years is largely due to how you control your dopamine now. And that is very, very true because if you look at motivation, say you've absolutely stuffed your dopamine system with high release, are you going to be motivated to go out and read a book that night? There's no chance. Whereas if you've gone through the steps of reducing the high potency activities you behave in, you get to a sort of base level, then all of a sudden reading a book or taking on some other pursuit that's not as highly releasing in the short term becomes attractive at that point.
Yeah.
And it's only by controlling your habits and your addictions in some sense before you can get to the point where you're functional enough that you're motivated to do these less rewarding things in the short term. Because the interesting thing, it's like compound interest. All of these activities that you engage in today, the ones that aren't that rewarding, lend themselves to the massive reward at the end, whether it be the job, the family, the business, whatever your end goal is essentially.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. And further to that point, I think social media has kind of corrupted people's dopamine system in a sense, where they're viewing all these high release activities every day and subconsciously in their mind it's maybe I should be doing that too.
Yeah.
But that's not the case at all.
No.
It's actually completely okay to sit at home and read a book for the whole day. Like there's nothing wrong with doing, so to speak, that boring shit and just grafting out and working. Not that your whole life should be contrived of just work and no friends, no family. That's not, you know, an ideal situation. But there's nothing wrong with, for a week, just working or reading books or doing things that are mundane.
Yeah. Well, that's where the success is built.
Yeah, exactly right.
That point about social media, it's very interesting because we do live in a society that values certain things, right? And obviously wealth and stuff is a signifier of someone's competence in an area. Right. So it is attractive to see a really wealthy person because you go, wow, they are an impressive person. But the problem with social media is it sort of perverts that sort of way of life because it's easy for you to go online and sort of present yourself in a certain way while disregarding all of the stuff that might counter that image that you've sort of created. Like you can go on tomorrow and essentially lie about who you really are. And because of the nature of social media where it's very difficult to get a gauge of what someone is actually like in real life because you're obviously just taking videos and you're posting selective content. So people end up believing sort of fake images in some extent. And at that point, if you're believing that you can go out and you can create businesses at 21 years old and be a multi-millionaire, well, that's going to be quite destructive to your outlook towards reality.
Yeah, it's mass delusion.
Yeah.
But also, even if it's not mass delusion, people are not posting the process. You're just seeing the end goal. As we said previously, you're seeing everybody else's end goal. Yeah. And these people are probably by and large a conglomerate of the 1%. Yeah. Nobody's showcasing them just sitting at home working.
100%.
So it's, again, to the point we said previously, your dopamine's been released by the end goal, and it's not even your end goal.
And no time in history has it ever been so widely accessible to see these hyper-successful individuals. In some sense, they're creating this hyper unrealistic image of what it means to be successful, because by definition, not everyone can be the 1%. There has to be the 99% that is average in some extent. Like the 1%, yeah, like I said, are definitionally the 1%.
That's right. It's all relative.
Yeah.
If everyone was the 1%, there wouldn't be a 1%. So
Yeah.
it just keeps progression, and there's a threshold.
Yeah.
If the 1%'s $1 million today, it might be $1 billion in 10 years. So not everybody's going to be a part of that. And I
Yeah.
guess what you're trying to stipulate is the dangers of constantly viewing only that probably does corrupt your dopamine system to some degree, or
Yeah.
a large degree.
Yeah. Now, the other point I want to make is, before we go on to talk about, I suppose, what the optimal way of viewing, I suppose, your next steps, is just to stipulate that every human has certain base drives, right? They have hunger, they have thirst, they have need for reproduction. These are things that are controlled by a part of your brain that is outside of your conscious control in some sense. So when you get hungry, you don't consciously decide to tell yourself that you're hungry. That comes up automatically. And it does that because in order for you to survive, your brain has to regulate that automatically in some sense. Those base drives take precedent over any other higher order thinking. So essentially, what that means is that unless all of those base drives are in order, and unless all of those base drives are controlled and satiated, you're not going to be able to engage in the more difficult, higher order behaviors. So what that means is that if you're addicted to fast food and you're controlled by that, well, it's going to divide you. And in some sense, you're not going to be in control of your behaviors. Same as if you're addicted to porn. That behavior is controlling you to some extent. And because those base drives are so powerful, well, you're not going to be able to be as functional in those more difficult tasks. So I suppose going back to the episode we did on addiction, it's very important that before you start trying to engage in difficult things like starting a business or undergoing some sort of transformation, you have to get those base drives in order.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And to take to the extreme, which we do a lot of the time, is could a drug addict run a successful business?
No chance, not in the long run.
Exactly right. And I mean, people might be sitting there thinking, I'm not a drug addict. Why does that apply to me? Well, if you're addicted to something, what's the end goal? The end goal is the extreme. If you're addicted to any drug, the end goal is the extreme.
Yeah.
If you're addicted to alcohol, what's the end goal? So it's not to say you're there now, but if you don't control those base habits, as you just said, today, the next 10 years may and large be a bit of chaos.
Yeah. Well, right from the get-go of this episode, you're borrowing tomorrow's happiness when you engage in something outside of the normal dopamine release. That's going to catch up eventually is what we're trying to stipulate.
And you got to be aware of it. You got to be aware of, I'm doing this, but constantly accepting the consequence. And if you're okay with that, great. It's not to say you should never seek any sort of cheap dopamine whatsoever. That's not that's not an enjoyable life.
The next part I sort of want to talk about is, well, what happens next? What do you do after you've got all your habits in order, you're sort of at your baseline, and you have room, I suppose, to explore? Well, there's something called the hero's myth, essentially. And what that is it's been defined as a monomyth, essentially something that has been common to cultures throughout history in some extent. And what the hero's myth, the hero's journey is in essence, it's the process of confronting the unknown, confronting chaos, confronting the fear, seeing what's actually behind that veil, uncovering it, learning lessons, and then coming back to your community, coming back to your base point, essentially a new individual. It's a death and rebirth story in some sense. And through that process, you can actually develop yourself into something better, and you can use your new lessons to make the community around you better as well.
Right. So that's the leader of a community in a sense.
100%. Yeah.
And what you're saying is they're going out there and engaging in some sort of ambiguity that's different or perhaps fearful, and actually coming back to their community or their family and instilling those lessons.
That's right.
Is that a cycle, or is that you're going out there doing it once and you're coming back?
No, it's constant.
Right.
It's constant.
So it's a constant progression.
That's right. And the reason we're attracted to movies, etc., is because the hero's myth is the essential story. It's the hero that you're rooting for. It's the person that you identify with, because the hero is in every single individual. It's not just one or two people have this characteristic. Certain people might be engaging on the forefront of an industry and they might be more prominent, but it doesn't mean that they're any different than the average person sitting at home. The average person sitting at home is just as much as a hero. They just engage in different behaviors. So essentially what these stories in movies, etc., are showing is the hero starting at one point and the hero ending at a completely different point with a new set of ideas and preconceived notions that I suppose he has learnt along the journey in some extent. And the journey is never an easy one. It's a very difficult one where they've had to overcome obstacle after obstacle. Obviously you've watched movies where nothing really happens. They're the boring movies. Human beings will accept a certain amount of hardship purely because that's the most rewarding way of existing in some extent.
And purely because you're probably going to have some reward for it in the long run.
Yeah.
It's not just hardship indefinitely. And I think what you said previously is everybody is that hero. You know, you could be the hero in your own family. Maybe they've never been educated, you're the first one to get a degree. Yeah. You're coming back to them and you're that hero archetype in your own family. It's not everybody needs to be Elon Musk or everybody needs to be this certain subtype of person. You can be your own hero in your own life. Yeah. And that's just as important and meaningful as anybody else doing it.
Oh, 100%. And what's interesting about that is it means there's a pathway forward for everyone. And the problem I see with social media is people subjugate themselves to other people's experiences when in reality they should be living those experiences themselves. So definitely one of the addictions I would say people need to bring down in some extent is addiction to social media.
Do you think that's more dangerous than addiction to a physical substance like alcohol? Sounds like a bizarre question, but it's a fair question.
I think it's a good question because I think it is the less accepted. It's the less.
It's much more pervasive.
It's pervasive because society accepts it way more. It's normal for you to be addicted to your phone in some extent, but if you see a meth addict, society goes, "Nah, that's bad."
But the process is much the same, and that's where I'm getting at. I think it's just normal for people to wake up today and sit on their phone for an hour, but was that normal 100 or 200 years ago?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, that's my point. So just because something's socially accepted doesn't mean it's going to be acceptable in the long run.
No. It's death by 1,000 cuts rather than one in some extent, but you still die.
That's right. And the meth addict didn't just start injecting large amounts of meth. It happened very progressively. And social media, whether that's alcohol, it's much the same. And just because it's not a physical effect, you're not injecting, ice or drinking alcohol, doesn't mean it's any less dangerous.
No, it doesn't. But I suppose continuing on the point of the hero's journey, there's a psychological idea, right? And it's from Jung, who we've borrowed a lot of ideas from. Essentially, he says you're going to be pulled apart before you're going to be put together. And what you can take away from that is essentially that when you accept this way of living, the hero's journey, you accept that you're going to be constantly tested and all of your ideas and all of your preconceived notions are essentially going to be stripped of what is not in line with reality. And what that means is that you're going to have to drop a lot of yourself that you thought were fact. And that's going to be a painful process for a lot of people. And that's what he means by you're going to be pulled apart. every part of you that doesn't actually serve you and the higher good has to die so that you can adopt more, I suppose, you can adopt a view that's more in line with reality.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And before I let you continue, a lot of us walk around with maladaptivities, essentially things that you've developed in yourself to cope with sort of stresses in the everyday environment. And the problem with maladaptivities is they blind you from reality in some extent. They're a coping mechanism. And when you undergo some hero's journey, some journey that tests you outside of yourself, a lot of those maladaptivities that you've been using to cope and survive have to go away.
Yeah.
And that's going to be very painful for a lot of people, essentially.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as you said, Carl Jung, that quote, you got to pull yourself apart before you can find yourself. That lends itself to this hero archetype thing we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because when you engage in that journey, you're essentially shaping yourself and you're perhaps losing these preconceived notions you had. I guess my question on that is, how has that journey changed over time? Because I guess your typical hero archetype thousands of years ago is not the one today.
Well, I think you're referring to, when you talk about a hero, usually you're talking about like brute strength or the leader of like an army or something along those lines. That's sort of what people refer to when they're talking about it. But the reality is anyone that confronts the unknown and learns lessons from it is following that archetype. So in the modern day example, we all work in offices, we all work in places where there still is opportunity to confront the unknown. Like, I suppose getting back to what are your fears?
Right.
Because the other thing is, Jung says that if you follow the most optimally meaningful path, generally it leads you to the place you're most fearful. And the reason it does that is because that's where all the learning sort of occurs in some sense. Like that's where you're going to be able to extend yourself past your limits. Peterson and Jung are very similar, and I've watched a few lectures of Peterson where he talks about this thing of when you put yourself in a very stressful situation that in your mind you thought was too large for you to, I suppose, overcome, you actually surprise yourself with how competent you can actually be. One of the adaptations of your conscious thought was that you can think about possible consequences. And the problem with that is you can imagine things that aren't in line with reality. And that lends itself to being more fearful than I suppose you should be of the situation. But you have parts in your brain that are out of your conscious control and don't kick in unless they're needed in some extent. So unless you put yourself in the situation, you never know what you're capable of, is what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, so you got to face your fears in a sense.
100%.
Yeah, and we've talked about that previously. Like we tend to overestimate danger and harm and underestimate how much responsibility we can probably undertake. Mm-hmm. And I guess you can only truly find how far you can go in something if you're, prepared to push some barriers.
Yeah. And
that's probably true. But going back to that hero archetype, do the people around this archetype in some sense get a release of dopamine? We talked previously about when you're watching these movies and you see this, catalyst go from zero to everything, you're instilled with a sense of dopamine as well. Mm-hmm. That's much the same if there's someone in your community or someone in your family doing the same thing. Yeah. Just by viewing you, they're actually getting a sense of dopamine as well.
Yeah. So what is your question? Is the hero getting adequate releases of dopamine? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying once the hero establishes or reaches that end result, he's actually getting less dopamine than the people around him.
That's right.
Because the majority of dopamine you actually get is thinking about the end goal, and then you get it one day and you realise, wait, this is not as exhilarating as I thought it was. And I think at that point, it's actually the people around you that are getting the most dopamine.
100%. Yeah. But the thing is as well, it's the thought, but also the process. The process of actively moving towards the goal is actually being found biologically to release the most dopamine.
Yep.
So it's not the end goal, it's the process. And that reflects everything we're saying about the hero's journey in some sense. It's the constant confronting. It's the constant learning and then moving forward that's going to be most rewarding. It's not just the end goal.
No.
It's the constant progression.
I mean, you hear that a lot. It's all about the process, and it is really the case. Like whatever it is that you want to do in life, it's more about the sort of person you become along the way than just getting that material reward at the end of the road.
Yeah.
So I guess in today's world, particularly young people, they're only purported that end result. And we talked about social media. You're looking at that constant end goal. That's dangerous in the sense
100%.
people are romanticizing probably all the wrong things.
It's putting people in a position where they're actually not in touch with reality.
That's right.
Your biology tells you literally, this isn't just some philosophical or psychological truth. Your biology tells you as well that the most meaningful life is the one of constant progression.
And I think the real problem with that is you may get these things at some point and then you realise that maybe I didn't want this to begin with. And at that point, you may have wasted or embarked on a journey that's probably not something you wanted to do to begin with. Because it was so readily available online, you thought, this is what I want to do, and I want to have these cars and travel the world and do a multitude of, I guess, tangible things. But, you're no better off than you were years ago when you had none of this stuff.
Well, you bring up a good point because we're talking about everything you shouldn't do. And one of the confusing parts is, well, it's great. I know all the negative stuff that doesn't help me, but what are the positive things that I can actually do? Like, what is it tomorrow that I can start to do that would lend me towards this constant progression? Because I think that's where people get caught up. They think that they should be tomorrow the CEO of some company, or tomorrow going out and starting this business. But if you're so low down on, say, the skills hierarchy or even on the social hierarchy, those end goals are unrealistic right now. You have to build and build and build before you can get to those things that are supposed romanticized on social media, like you're saying. So the point I would say on that is, and this is actually a religious idea, it's not about what you do. It's about your attitude towards what you're doing. So you could do anything, right? You could do anything that is perhaps available and good to do. It could be a job, it could be a career, it could be some sort of development. It's more about looking at every individual situation and trying to get the best good out of that situation. And it's through that process that things will unlock themselves. You might get the opening for the next job by doing well in the current thing you're doing. Don't look 10 steps out in front. Look at what's right in front of you now and look at what you can make better right now. Because even when we had a conversation with one of the successful guys we know when we were sort of going around having conversations, he said that the thing that made him the most money came to him through the progression of the thing he currently had. It wasn't that he went out with the idea in his head to do this. It's that he had something in front of him that he could do, and through that, other opportunities open themselves.
Yeah, the opportunities in the opportunity in some sense. Yeah. And, he said in some sense that he got lucky, but he didn't really, because he engaged in what can I do tangibly and practically tomorrow? And by doing that, doors open. And I think we've spoke about this before, and I think it's no rocket science that you do create your own luck. Yeah. And I think you do that by controlling your dopamine. Yeah. You do that by waking up every day and not chasing cheap dopamines, whether that's going for whether that's exercising or, eating the right things, whatever it is. It's largely unlikely you're going to build a meaningful life engaging in activities that are considered cheap.
That's right. You need the foundation.
You need that foundation. Yeah. And that's the principle with every aspect of life. Whether it's in the gym, you're not going to look amazing tomorrow. No. You need that foundation first. You need to eat the right things. You need to feed yourself the right things mentally to look a certain way, to run a certain way and to be a certain way. Yeah. And I guess, as you said before, we focused a lot of the things you shouldn't do. What are some of those things that you should do on an everyday basis? Simple, practical things that people can be doing.
Well, like I said, it's looking at what's in front of you right now. Everyone probably has a job. They could be a dishy at a restaurant. they can still make the most of that situation. If you show you're highly competent and responsible in that smaller role, the likelihood that the chef is going to want to promote you to, say, a kitchen hand is highly likely. They know that they can depend on you. And before long, through adopting responsibility, you could be running the restaurant.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that delusionally either. I've done that in my own life. I started at a low role in my previous job, and eventually I did have the top position in the restaurant. And I'm not trying to overemphasize my abilities, but adopting responsibility in whatever you're doing is a key to this process.
It's how you do anything is how you'll do everything, essentially.
Yeah.
And I guess no matter how mundane your job is, you're saying your attitude to it is ultimately what's going to dictate your end reward.
Yeah. And even someone we both look up to, in a sense, Warren Buffett, he talks about the most successful person in this classroom, because he was lecturing a bunch of people, is the person with the most character in some sense. It's the person that's willing to go above and beyond. It's not the smartest genius that, I suppose, has the highest IQ. It's the person, I suppose, that's willing to do what's done and more.
Yeah.
I suppose the last aspect of this hero's journey, and I'll round off with this, is once you've gone through this transformational process, essentially you've dropped parts of yourself that you once were, and you now have new aspects to yourself. And one of the things that happens in this story is that the hero often tries to go and reconvene with their old friendships, or they go and try and reconvene at an old job or something like that. And what actually happens is they no longer fit in with that group of people or with that business. And it's because they're no longer the same person in some fundamental sense. And it is sort of a double-edged sword, because it means that once you change, you can never go back.
And the people around you change as well.
That's right.
So
or they don't change. Right. Or they don't change, and you can't. They hinder your progress forward in some sense.
Right. So the parts of yourself that were keeping you attached to these people have kind of been shaped away as you progress to that journey.
Yeah.
Right. And then you come back to that same community and you realise, these people haven't changed at all. No. Or maybe they were never for me in the first place.
And it's not some savage thing of you cutting people off, but you have no moral obligation to these people in some sense. If people don't serve you, and I'm not talking about in some self-centered way where they should be giving me stuff. It's more about, are they value add to my life? Do they accept me for who I've become now? And are they willing to grow and adapt as well? Because if someone's not willing to do that, then there's probably no point you associating with those people anymore.
So what are you saying? You should cut all these people off?
I'm not saying you should cut them off brashly, but if you've gone through some process, you've become a different person, your position there is no longer, essentially.
It's redundant. Yeah, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
I guess to wrap up, we've talked about dopamine, we've talked about this archetype. How important do you think it is for young kids in particular to start with this foundation as opposed to getting to your late 30s or getting to your, early 40s and then realise, wait, there's real holes in my life and there's real holes in my everyday habits. How can I change now? It's a much harder thing to do when you're 40 than it is when you're 20, right?
Well, it's along the similar point I made earlier about the longer you go through life sort of just coping and building maladaptivities, the harder it is going to be to strip those away. And in some cases, some wounds will be too deep to heal in some sense. So the older you start doing this process, it's not to say it can't be done, but behaviours become ingrained.
That's right.
And it is very hard to change something if it's a 20-year habit compared to if it was a year habit.
The hole just gets deeper.
Yeah.
And it's much easier to confront yourself today than it will be in 10 years from now.
Yeah. And we are trying to target younger people. Like, it'd be great if older people watch and stuff, but they are limited by they don't have as much time left in some sense as well. So,
I mean, once you're old and you got responsibilities, you got kids, you got a mortgage, you got a family, it's much harder to engage in this process of, you know, as Carl Jung would say, individuation. Because there's just so much on your plate at that point.
Yeah.
You can't just say, I'm going to neglect my family so I can, you know, strive towards this path. Because to finish, you do have a moral virtue and an obligation to your family.
Yeah.
And you can't just neglect that.
Yeah. Well, I'll make a very important point. Your journey could be your family. So you don't have to go out and start a business or something like that. Your journey could be having the best relationship possible with your wife and your children. Say you had a bad relationship with your family. That could be the most meaningful thing you could do. It's so individually specific that you can't go online and just accept face value advice from anyone. Like, it's so individual to the person. So we're definitely not disregarding people that have a family. That's one of the things that you should get in order, your relationship with your family.
Yeah, but you should also get your affairs in order at an early age.
Yeah, before you're burdened by later pressures.
Well, that's right, yeah. The older you get, the more weight you have that's dragging you down in a multitude of directions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my point is you got to have that aggression early in life to face those fears, as opposed to just, you know, surviving and coping until you realise that, you know, it may be too late or maybe too strenuous for me to undergo a massive amount of change now.
Yeah. Yeah. My finishing words will be, don't see fear as something you have to cope with. See fear as something that you have to confront.